In the quiet suburbs of Indiana, 1993, a husband and father left work early, calling home to say he wasn't feeling well. He never returned. His car was later found at the airport, his passport still in the drawer, his coat still hanging by the door. No tickets, no witnesses, no trace. What could make an ordinary man walk out of his life on an ordinary day, leaving everything behind? Richard Hoagland, 39, fit that rhythm perfectly. He worked as an insurance manager for a mid-sized firm in Indianapolis. He was tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders, and spoke in a measured, thoughtful tone. His co-workers called him dependable, a man who followed routine as if it were a personal code. Every morning at 7:30, he left his house wearing a gray suit and tie, coffee in hand. Every evening, by 6:30, he returned to the same white-fenced home on a quiet cul-de-sac. His wife, Linda, stayed home with their 2 sons, Matthew, 9, and Doug, 6. Their life was ordinary: birthday parties, school projects, church on Sundays, and occasional family trips to Florida. A framed photo from one of those trips hung above the living room mantel, all 4 of them smiling under a blue sky. There was nothing about that picture, or their life, that hinted at what would come. February 10th, 1993, began without incident. It was a cold Wednesday, the air thin and gray, snow melting in dirty piles by the roadside. Richard went to work as usual. Around mid-afternoon, he told a colleague he wasn't feeling well and planned to stop by a hospital before heading home. No one thought much of it. He gathered his papers, straightened his tie, and left the building. That was the last verified moment anyone saw him alive. At 5:15 p.m., Linda received a phone call. Richard's voice sounded distant and faint, as though coming through static. He told her he felt sick and was going to the hospital to be checked. It was a brief, almost routine exchange. He didn't sound frightened or confused. Linda told him to call once he'd seen a doctor. He said he would. Then he hung up. By 6:30, Linda set dinner on the table. The food cooled as minutes passed. 8 o'clock came, and the phone stayed silent. She began calling local hospitals, first the one nearest to his office, then 2 others nearby. None of them had admitted a patient named Richard Hoagland. At 10:30, she called his office. His co-workers confirmed he had left earlier that day. By midnight, worry turned to panic. She called the police. The following morning, 2 uniformed officers from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department arrived to take a statement. They asked when she'd last spoken to him, what he'd been wearing, whether he'd been under stress. Linda's answers were consistent: gray suit, briefcase, no recent problems. She mentioned the phone call, how normal he'd sounded, and how strange it seemed that he hadn't come home. Later that afternoon, police located Richard's car, a silver sedan, parked in the long-term parking lot of the Indianapolis International Airport. It was locked, clean, and perfectly centered between 2 other cars. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Inside, officers found his briefcase, a few papers, and a half-empty coffee cup. His wallet and identification were missing, but the rest of the car was untouched. Investigators ran the license plate through the airport system and cross-checked it against flight records. There were no tickets purchased under Richard Hoagland's name, that day or afterward. No passenger matching his description boarded any flight out of Indianapolis. When they checked nearby rental agencies, hotels, and bus stations, the results were the same. No trace. Meanwhile, Linda searched the house again and again, trying to make sense of what was left behind. His passport, toothbrush, and razor still sat on the bathroom counter. The closet was full. Every shirt, every suit still hanging in its place. Even his winter coat, the one he wore every day, was still draped over the chair by the front door. Nothing was missing. No luggage, no cash withdrawals, no notes or messages. To investigators, it was the purest form of disappearance. No crime scene, no evidence of departure, no clear motive. Detective Ron Baines, assigned to the case, summarized it in his initial report. Vehicle recovered. No indication of travel. Subject unaccounted for. Linda struggled to hold the household together. She told the boys their father had fallen ill, but would come home soon. Each night she left the porch light on. Neighbors came by with casseroles, offering sympathy and speculation. "Maybe he just needed space," someone said. "Maybe he's staying with a friend." But there were no friends unaccounted for, no phone calls, no sign of voluntary flight. Days passed into weeks. The police continued to chase faint leads, a possible sighting at a truck stop in Ohio, a man resembling Richard in a Kentucky motel. But each fell apart under scrutiny. The descriptions were vague. The timelines didn't match. His financial records remained still. His paycheck deposits stopped after February 10th. The only motion left was the slow accumulation of unanswered questions. By early March, the investigation stalled. The car sat in an impound lot, evidence sealed and logged. The case file on Baines's desk remained thin. One missing person, one abandoned vehicle, 0 leads. In a final attempt to understand, Linda walked through their house one more time, studying every detail: the neat bed, the photographs, the toothbrush still damp in its holder. Everything about the room looked alive, as if its owner might return at any moment. Yet the silence told a different story. Richard Hoagland had vanished, leaving behind a car that had not traveled, a home that had not been disturbed, and a family frozen between disbelief and dread. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no farewell. Not even a misplaced object to hint at where he'd gone. It was as if a man had stepped out of his life and dissolved into thin air. And from that day forward, no one ever saw him again. The morning after Richard Hoagland disappeared, the quiet suburb of Fishers, Indiana, began to stir with unease. News of his absence spread first among neighbors, then to the small community where he worked. By noon, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department had opened an investigation. To most officers, it seemed like a routine missing person case. A man leaves home, doesn't return, perhaps a medical emergency or an accident. They didn't yet know that this would stretch into one of the strangest files in the county's history. Detective Ron Baines, a veteran with the measured calm of someone who'd seen too many false alarms, took charge of the file. He began with the basics: timeline, motive, money. The truth of a disappearance, he told his younger partner, usually hides in the math. If someone leaves on purpose, the numbers always change. Withdrawals, card swipes, cash transfers. So Baines ordered a full financial sweep. Within days, the results came back. No activity. Richard's bank account sat frozen since February 9th. His credit cards were untouched, mortgage payments static, utilities still auto-paid. Not a single cent had moved. That detail unsettled Baines more than if the man had drained his accounts. "People don't just stop existing," he said quietly, tapping the report. "Even the dead leave traces." Linda, meanwhile, was living hour to hour. Detectives came and went, taking photographs of the house, cataloging what had been left behind. The gray suit in the closet, the toothbrush still damp, the coat on the chair by the door. When she opened the drawers, every piece of his life was still there. Receipts, watch, passport, even a book left open on the nightstand. The officers asked the usual questions. Was he depressed, seeing anyone, in debt? She shook her head each time. "He was tired," she said, "but he wasn't running." The investigation widened. Police checked every hospital in Indiana, then neighboring states. They found nothing. The car at the airport, neatly locked, yielded no leads. No fingerprints but his own, no tickets issued, no sign of travel under any variation of his name. By the end of the week, the case had gone from hopeful to hollow. When the story hit local television, sympathy for the Hoaglands flooded in. "A devoted father of two vanishes without a trace," the anchor read. The camera showed a smiling family portrait, Richard with his arm around Linda, the boys in matching shirts, the image of stability suddenly shattered. Neighbors offered small recollections for the camera. One woman said, "He was friendly, always waved. Nothing seemed wrong." Another added, "That morning he looked normal. He even said, 'See you. Tomorrow.'" The ordinary details made the mystery heavier, not lighter. Linda's face appeared in the evening news, pale, calm, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you see him, please tell him to come home. The boys miss him." Behind that composure, her nights were sleepless. She kept the porch light burning, afraid to let the house go dark. When the phone rang, her heart raced, only to drop at the sound of a telemarketer's voice. The police called often, but always with the same answer: no updates. After a few weeks, even those calls slowed down. At school, Matthew and Doug became the quiet children. Linda told them their father was away on a business trip. It was easier than explaining disappearance to two boys still learning subtraction. Matthew stopped asking after a while, but Doug kept leaving drawings on the kitchen table: airplanes, beaches, stick figures of 4 people instead of 3. "So Dad will know where to find us," he said. Months passed, the investigation thinning like smoke. The detectives still checked interstate bus lines, rental cars, and motels, but every lead ended the same way: no match. "It's like he was erased," Baines muttered one night as he filed another dead-end report. By early summer, the case had lost its momentum. Newspapers had moved on, but the family remained frozen in the same story: a house half lived in, a name unspoken. Linda stopped giving interviews. The sympathy of strangers began to feel like surveillance. People asked if she was all right, then lingered too long waiting for a dramatic answer. And then, nearly a year later, a letter arrived. It was March, Doug's birthday month. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar at first glance, slightly uneven, as if written by someone who hadn't held a pen in a while. Inside was a simple card with a cartoon of a fishing boat and, tucked neatly inside, a crisp $50 bill. The message was short. "Maybe sometime soon we'll get to see each other. I bet I won't even know you. Mind your mother. Love, Dad." Linda's breath caught as she read it. The handwriting, now that she looked closely, did resemble Richard's. The phrasing, the slant of the letters, the uneven tail of the Y. But something was wrong. It felt too careful, too deliberate, as though someone were imitating his style rather than writing naturally. She turned the envelope over. The postmark was from Illinois. No return address. She read the card again and again, half afraid the words might change. Then, the next morning, she took it to the sheriff's office. Detectives photographed it, dusted for prints, tested the stamp for DNA. Nothing. The letter had been wiped clean. The return address traced to an abandoned property outside Peoria. "Could be him," one officer said. "Could be a hoax." Baines refused to speculate. "If it's really him," he said, "he doesn't want to be found." Linda kept the card, hidden for weeks, unsure whether to show it to the boys. Eventually, she gave it to Matthew. The boy read it silently, expression unreadable. "He says he'll come back," he murmured. She didn't reply. 3 months later, another card arrived, this one for Matthew's birthday. Same handwriting, Same $50. Same brief, distant message. Be good. Mind your mother. The postmark this time was from Missouri. That detail, more than anything, convinced Baines that whoever sent it was moving, staying one step ahead of something or someone. The media caught wind of the letters, reigniting the story. Missing father contacts family from afar? The headlines asked. Journalists knocked on the Hoagland door again. Linda refused to speak. It doesn't help, she told the detective. It just opens the wound. For a moment, the case flickered back to life. Police rechecked the financial records, still dormant. Airlines, DMV, tax returns. Nothing. The letters were the only pulse left in a dead file. But even as the world sympathized with Linda, not everyone in law enforcement believed her story. Around the third year of the disappearance, whispers began to circulate in the department. What if he didn't disappear? One officer asked. What if she helped him? Another countered. Or what if she did something to him and staged it? There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of financial gain, but suspicion feeds on absence. Baines was questioned about his handling of the case. He stood by his work, insisting that Linda had cooperated fully, that there was no motive, no profit, no pattern of deceit. Still, the cloud remained. By 1996, the investigation had cooled to what police call a paper case, reviewed once a year, then returned to the archives. Linda stopped answering calls from detectives unless absolutely necessary. I told them everything, she said once, her voice steady but distant. There's nothing left to say. In town, gossip replaced evidence. Some believed Richard had run off with another woman. Others thought he'd been murdered and buried somewhere quiet. The story hardened into local folklore, retold in diners and gas stations, the man who went to the airport and vanished into thin air. For Linda and the boys, the years began to divide neatly, before and after the phone call. Every photograph, every holiday carried that invisible line. The family portrait on the mantel faded in the sunlight until Richard's image grew pale, almost transparent. Detective Baines, nearing retirement, kept the case folder on a corner of his desk. Sometimes, late at night, he'd leaf through the reports, the photos, the financial charts, the copies of the birthday cards, and wonder if he had missed something obvious. Every mystery starts simple, he said once, then turns around and stares you down for the rest of your life. The trail by then had grown cold. Yet, beneath that stillness, one truth lingered. Disappearances don't stay buried forever. Somewhere, far from Indiana, the man who had walked away was still walking, under another sun, under another name. No one could have known it yet, but while his family mourned him and detectives filed their reports, Richard Hoagland was alive. He was living as someone else, in a place where no one asked questions. And in the empty house on that quiet street in Fishers, the porch light still burned, waiting for a man who would never come home. By the winter of 1996, the case of Richard Hoagland had slipped quietly into the archive shelves of the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department. The man who had vanished without warning 3 years earlier had become a cold file, a thin folder of unanswered questions gathering dust under fluorescent light. There were no new leads, no new letters, no new sightings. The phone that once rang nightly with tips had gone silent. Detective Ron Baines, now nearing retirement, made one final review of the evidence before submitting his closing summary. No confirmed contact since February 10, 1993. Financial, travel, and communication records inactive. Case suspended pending new information. In bureaucratic language, suspended meant forgotten. Still, before closing the file, the department summoned Linda Hoagland one last time. She sat across from a new investigator, younger, less patient, who reopened old questions. Were there any recent arguments? Did your husband mention leaving? Did he have insurance? Linda answered the same way she always had. No arguments, no debts, no signs of despair. Her voice was steady, but her face carried the stillness of exhaustion. She'd repeated these answers so many times that they no longer felt like words, just echoes in an empty room. Some officers whispered doubts behind closed doors. A disappearance without ransom, without theft, without violence was hard to explain. "If he's dead," one detective muttered, "where's the body? And if he's alive, who helped him?" The speculation shifted subtly, from Richard's absence to Linda's potential guilt. She endured multiple rounds of questioning. Her bank accounts were examined, her phone records reviewed. Every corner of her life was turned over for signs of deceit. They found nothing. No hidden funds, no life insurance payout, no suspicious transactions. What remained was a portrait of a woman trapped in limbo. Not a widow, not a wife, and not free. Without a husband's income, Linda's life contracted sharply. The mortgage company froze the property pending investigation. The family's car, still registered under Richard's name, was repossessed. Bank accounts tied to him were inaccessible. Lawyers explained she could not claim ownership until he was legally declared dead, a process that would take years. Bills mounted, then defaulted. In the spring of 1994, Linda packed a few boxes, clothes, photographs, school books, and left the white-fenced house in Fishers. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warm dinners was sold off at auction, its contents divided among creditors. She and her two sons moved into her mother's modest house in Carmel, a quieter neighborhood shaded by old maples. There, life shrank to essentials. Mornings of getting the boys ready for school, evenings spent balancing a checkbook that never quite aligned. Linda found part-time work as a bookkeeper at a dental clinic. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Each evening she walked home beneath the streetlights, carrying the day's weariness like a physical weight. In her mother's living room stood a small shelf with only two objects that still belonged to Richard: a framed wedding photograph and a simple gold ring, his wedding band, which she kept polished though he would never wear it again. The rest of his belongings had been sold, donated, or boxed away. The boys adapted differently. Matthew, the older one, turned inward. He rarely spoke of his father, though sometimes at night he would sit by the window, looking out at nothing, as if waiting for headlights to return. Doug, younger and more impressionable, began to lose the shape of his father's face in his memory. He once asked his mother, "If Dad comes back, will he know where we live now?" Linda had no answer. At school, both learned the quiet cruelty of small-town gossip. Other children whispered, "His dad ran away. His mom did something." They learned to walk past those words without reacting. Over time, silence became their shield. By 1998, 5 years after the disappearance, the Hoagland case was barely remembered outside of the family and a few retired officers. Detective Baines, now out of the force, kept the file's summary report folded in his personal notebook. "It bothered me," he later said. "Most men who vanish either die or surface within a year. But he just didn't." Linda, meanwhile, focused on survival. She avoided interviews, declined reporters' calls. The old sympathy had soured into curiosity, and curiosity into pity. She learned to live with being the woman whose husband had vanished, a kind of identity she had never chosen but could never shed. The seasons blurred together. The boys grew, graduated from middle school, then high school. Each milestone carried an invisible absence. At Doug's 8th grade ceremony, Linda sat among parents clapping for their children, her hands still in her lap. "He should have been here," she whispered once, then stopped herself, realizing she no longer knew which he she meant. The man who disappeared, or the one she'd imagined might return. In the late 1990s, a few half-hearted tips came in. Sightings in Arizona, a man resembling Richard in a Florida motel, but every lead collapsed under scrutiny. No fingerprints, no verification, no closure. The Van Hoagland file remained in the cold storage room of the sheriff's office, alphabetized between hundreds of others. The name meant little to the new generation of officers. The silence stretched into years, then into habit. In 2003, exactly a decade after the disappearance, Linda's attorney advised her to file for a declaration of death in absentia. Under Indiana law, if a person has been missing for 7 or more years with no sign of life, a court can declare them legally deceased. It was not an act of belief, but of necessity, a way to close accounts, to move forward, to breathe again. The hearing was brief. A judge, a clerk, Linda, and her lawyer. The courtroom was nearly empty, the air still. The judge reviewed the file, asked perfunctory questions, then signed the decree. Richard Hoagland is hereby declared deceased, effective February 10, 2003. Linda left the courthouse quietly, the document folded in her purse. Outside, spring sunlight shimmered across parked cars. For 10 years, she had lived inside an open wound. Now the law had stitched it closed. With the ruling, she was finally able to regain control of her finances. The frozen assets were released, debts settled, and her sons could apply for aid under survivor benefits. That same year, she remarried a gentle, unassuming man named Tom Eisler, who worked in the same clinic where she did accounting. He never asked too much about the past. She never offered much in return. Together they bought a small home, nothing extravagant, just quiet. In photographs from that time, Linda looked older but lighter, her smile faint but genuine. It felt like exhaling, she said years later. For the first time, life moved forward without looking over its shoulder. By all appearances, the story had ended. Richard Hoagland was legally dead. His family healed in the only way possible, through acceptance. The local police closed the file permanently, marking it resolved by declaration. But hundreds of miles to the south, under a Florida sun that burned bright over palm-lined streets, a man calling himself Terry Szymanski was living in quiet comfort. He had a wife, a son, and a career in real estate. He paid taxes, renewed his pilot's license, and tended his backyard every Saturday morning. He was, by all accounts, a good neighbor. No one suspected that his life was borrowed, that the man mowing the lawn in Zephyr Hills had once been declared legally dead in Indiana. While one family in the Midwest mourned a man who never returned, another family in Florida lived beside a man who should never have been alive. The irony was almost poetic. The law had closed the file, but the story itself had not ended. It had simply changed its name. In Indiana, Linda occasionally caught herself wondering what kind of man Richard would have become had he lived. The thought was fleeting, almost abstract. She no longer felt anger nor longing, only distance. "It's strange," she told a friend once. "He's gone, but he still takes up space." Her sons, now adults, carried the story differently. Matthew kept his father's ring in a drawer. Doug refused to keep anything at all. Each learned to define their lives not by the absence, but by what remained. And so the years moved on quietly, unaware that somewhere far away, in a town bathed in sunlight, the man they buried in paperwork was still alive, walking, breathing, laughing, beneath another man's name. The file was cold. The world had stopped asking. But the story of Richard Hoagland was not over. Not yet. When Richard Hoagland drove south out of Indiana in early 1993, he was not fleeing the law, nor chasing fortune. Only distance. distance from the life that had once defined him. The neat house, the wife who waited, the children who asked too many questions, the routines that had grown heavy like chains. No one knew his route, and no record would ever show it. But sometime that spring, he crossed the flatlands into Florida, the land of new beginnings and quiet disappearances. He drifted along the Gulf Coast, where sunlight softened everything and no one asked for history. In the sprawl of small towns and empty motels between Tampa and the sea, he found a place to vanish. Cash in hand, he rented a single room behind a pale blue house owned by an aging widower. The man's name was Mr. Szymanski. Quiet, polite, the sort who smoked on his porch at dusk and didn't pry. His son, a fisherman named Terry, had drowned in a boating accident 2 years earlier. The old man spoke of him sometimes, just enough for Richard to know that the son had been young, unmarried, and buried in a local cemetery. For a while, Richard kept to himself. He worked odd jobs, repairing docks, painting boats, taking whatever came his way. At night, he read old newspapers and watched the sky darken over the water. He had shed one life, but had not yet built another. The past still clung to him, in his cautious movements, in the way he avoided mirrors, in the quiet panic that gripped him whenever someone asked his name. Then, sometime in 1994, as he prepared to move out, he found a folded document inside the drawer of the small desk he'd been using. It was a death certificate, slightly yellowed, creased at the edges, belonging to Terry P. Szymanski, born in 1963, deceased April 16, 1991. It listed cause of death, accidental drowning. At the bottom, the embossed state seal. He stared at it for a long time. To most, it was a relic of loss, an artifact of someone else's grief. To him, it was a key. That night, he sat by the window, the paper laid flat before him. Somewhere beyond the pain, a new identity waited, one that already existed, fully documented, unoccupied. A name attached to a life cut short, ready to be worn again. The following weeks passed in quiet precision. Richard sent a request to the State Vital Records Office, enclosing a copy of the death certificate and a polite note claiming he was a relative settling family affairs. A few weeks later, a birth certificate arrived in the mail. Clean, official, unquestioned. With that, he applied for a driver's license and a social security card, presenting the birth certificate as proof. No red flags, no verification system, no cross-state database to connect the living and the dead. The paperwork slid through like water. When he looked at the laminated card for the first time, name, Terry Patrick Szymanski, he saw himself reflected back, legally reborn. It was that simple. A man could disappear in one place and be resurrected in another with nothing more than a form and a stamp. In the mid-1990s, America was still porous in its bureaucracy. There was no national ID network, no linked digital records. The dead, as far as government systems were concerned, could live again if someone cared enough to give them breath. By 1995, Terry Szymanski was alive. He rented a small apartment in Zephyr Hills, a sleepy Florida town where the air smelled faintly of orange blossoms and salt. To the neighbors, he was polite and unremarkable, a man with a Midwestern accent and a quiet manner. He claimed to work in property management, sometimes fishing on weekends. No one questioned him. Florida was full of men who'd started over, each with their own reasons for keeping the past buried. In that new life, Richard met Mary Hickman, a local woman who worked at a bank. She was kind, practical, and unsuspecting. He told her that both his parents had passed away, that he had no close family. His story was sparse but consistent, the kind that earned sympathy rather than suspicion. They married in 1995, 4 years after the real Terry Szymanski had been declared dead. Mary and Terry bought a modest house on a quiet street. The deed bore his stolen name, and for the first time since vanishing, He felt rooted again. He was careful with money, generous with neighbors, and outwardly content. When their son was born, he stood beside Mary in the hospital, signing the birth certificate with a hand that did not tremble. To everyone around him, he was an ordinary husband, proud father, and responsible citizen. Over time, Terry became real, not just on paper, but in the way Richard inhabited him. He built a small real estate business, buying and selling modest homes across the county. He earned a pilot's license, flying a small single-engine Cessna along the Gulf for leisure. He kept precise records, paid taxes, renewed his license, all in the name of a man who had died young. His neighbors liked him. He was nice, one later recalled. Always helpful, never raised his voice, a good man. Another said, he loved his family. You'd never guess he was hiding anything. In the stillness of Florida afternoons, Richard, or Terry, would sometimes stand in his backyard, sunlight on his face, the hum of sprinklers in the distance. He had built a second life out of someone else's shadow, and the lie had become his truth. It wasn't wealth that drove him, nor danger. It was erasure, the desire to rewrite himself without the burden of the man he used to be. No family, no questions, no expectations. The clean slate had worked. Years passed easily. The world moved on. His old life in Indiana faded into rumor and paperwork. His family convinced of his death. His wife remarried. His sons grew up under another man's name. All the while, in Zephyr Hills, Terry trimmed his hedges, renewed his insurance, and watched his son grow taller each year. To the outside world, nothing was amiss. And yet, sometimes late at night, as he filed property documents or read in bed beside Mary, something inside him stirred. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. A name unspoken for decades, hovering at the edge of memory. He would turn off the light and lie still until it faded. By the early 2000s, his second life was complete. He owned several properties, paid his taxes, and enjoyed the quiet rhythm of middle age. His son entered high school. Mary worked at the local branch of the same bank where she had met him years before. They vacationed occasionally, beaches, road trips, small pleasures. No one questioned why Terry Szymanski had no family attending his wedding, no relatives visiting on holidays, no photographs older than 1993. Life in Florida was transient. People came and went, and no one kept track of anyone's beginnings. It was, by all appearances, a good life. And yet its foundation rested on a single brittle document, a death certificate folded long ago in the drawer of a stranger's house. Richard had built his peace upon another man's grave. There is a peculiar irony in how thoroughly he disappeared. In Indiana, Richard Hoagland was a ghost, a man mourned, declared dead, archived by law. In Florida, Terry Szymanski was alive, a man reborn, paying taxes, flying planes, raising a family. One body, two lives. For more than 20 years, those two realities existed side by side, never intersecting, never questioned. The man Linda once loved was mowing his lawn beneath palm trees, while she believed he lay somewhere beyond reach. The boys who had waited by the window grew into men, carrying the faint outline of a father who no longer existed. And somewhere far away, that father was living under the name of a fisherman who truly had drowned, taking his death as a disguise and turning it into a life. In the long afternoons of Zephyr Hills, neighbors would see him in his yard, shirt sleeves rolled, sweat darkening his collar. He waved to them, smiled faintly, and returned to trimming the grass. His son sometimes helped, laughing, tossing the hose, chasing the family dog across the lawn. Nothing about the scene betrayed the impossible truth beneath it. In Indiana, the file marked Hoagland Richard missing remained buried in a police archive. The case had gone cold, the name forgotten. In Florida, the same man lived under another sun, in a house filled with warmth, laughter, and borrowed time. He had escaped not into crime or adventure, but into ordinariness, the one disguise that never draws suspicion. While one world mourned him as dead, another knew him only as alive. A man erased from history had written himself back into it, as someone else, and for 23 years, the dead man lived. In the spring of 2016, more than 2 decades after Richard Hoagland vanished from Indiana, a quiet ripple of curiosity began thousands of miles away in Florida. Not from police or journalists, but from a young man searching for his family's past. His name was Terry Szymanski Jr., the nephew of the real Terry Patrick Szymanski, a fisherman who had drowned in 1991 in the Gulf of Mexico. Terry Jr. had grown up hearing the story, how his uncle's boat capsized, how his body was recovered days later, how the family buried him near Clearwater. It was a loss the family had accepted long ago, woven into memory and silence. Now in his 20s, Terry Jr. had taken an interest in genealogy. Like many Americans, he subscribed to Ancestry.com, uploading birth and death certificates, piecing together the branches of his family tree. It was meant to be a quiet hobby, something to honor the people whose names had faded with time. Late one evening, as he searched the database for Terry Patrick Szymanski, his uncle's profile appeared as expected. Born 1963, died 1991. But directly beneath that record was another entry that made him stop. It read, Marriage Record, 1995, Pasco County, Florida. At first he thought it was a data glitch. It wasn't unusual for online archives to misfile names. But curiosity turned to confusion when he clicked the entry and saw the details. Same birth date, same place of birth, same social security number. The certificate listed the groom as Terry P. Szymanski, the bride as Mary Hickman. The date, May 14, 1995, 4 years after the real Terry's death. He leaned closer to the screen. The database wasn't mistaken. Someone, somewhere, was living under his dead uncle's name. The next morning, Terry Jr. told his father, the real Terry's brother. Together, they pulled up state property records. There it was again. The same name, attached to multiple homes, all in Zephyr Hills, Florida. That's impossible, his father said quietly. We buried him. I saw the coffin. They stared at the screen for a long time before deciding to act. The family contacted the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, reporting a possible identity theft involving their deceased relative. Detective Tony Cardo received the file on a humid June morning. At first glance, it looked like routine administrative fraud. Florida, after all, saw hundreds of identity theft cases each year. But something about the timeline caught his attention. The death in 1991, the faux marriage in 1995, the clean records ever since. He started with a background check. The name Terry Patrick Szymanski appeared across multiple state databases, property deeds, driver's license, pilot's certificate, even voter registration. Everything matched. There was no indication of fraud, except for one irrefutable fact. According to the Florida Department of Health, that person was supposed to be dead. Cardo requested both sets of records, the 1991 death certificate and the current identification documents. When the files arrived, he placed them side by side on his desk. The birth dates matched exactly. The social security number, too. But the photos, the young fisherman who died at 23, and the middle-aged man with graying hair in the driver's license photo, were clearly not the same person. It was, quite literally, a dead man living on paper. Cardo leaned back in his chair. The simplicity of it was unnerving. Whoever this imposter was, he hadn't just used the name. He had built an entire life around it. Marriage, property, taxes, everything. No criminal history, no aliases, no red flags. "This isn't a scam," Cardo muttered. "This is something else." He decided to go in person. Zephyr Hills lay quiet that summer, a sprawl of small homes, oaks draped with moss, and the hum of cicadas filling the heat. Cardo drove down a tree-lined street until he found the address listed on the property records. A one-story beige house with a trimmed yard and a red pickup truck parked neatly in the driveway. He parked, checked his badge, and walked to the front door. A woman answered. Brown hair, early 50s, calm eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Cardo said. "Detective Tony Cardo, Pasco County Sheriff's Office. I'd like to speak with your husband, Mr. Szymanski, if he's available." A few moments later, a man appeared behind her. He was in his 60s, lean, clean-shaven, wearing a faded blue shirt. His expression was neutral but cautious. "I'm Terry," he said. "What's this about?" Cardo smiled politely. "Just some routine verification regarding property records. Mind if I come in for a minute?" They sat at the kitchen table. The air smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust. Cardo began with small talk, how long they'd lived there, what kind of work he did. The man answered easily, even warmly. "Real estate mostly," he said. "Been here about 20 years. "Could I see your driver's license, sir? Just for confirmation." Without hesitation, the man handed it over. Terry Patrick Szymanski. Date of birth, March 10, 1963. The document looked legitimate, unremarkable. Cardo studied it for a moment, then opened his folder and laid another paper gently on the table, a photocopy of the 1991 death certificate. When the man glanced down, the name on the page mirrored his own. For several seconds, he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the document, scanning the details. Date, cause of death, place of burial. Cardo's voice was calm. "Mr. Szymanski," he said softly, "according to the state of Florida, you've been dead for 25 years." The room went quiet. The ceiling fan clicked overhead. The man's face didn't change, but his breathing slowed. Mary looked between them, bewildered. "What's going on?" she asked. "What is this?" Her husband still didn't answer. His gaze remained on the paper, as if trying to read his way out of it. Cardo leaned forward. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again. Who are you really?" The silence stretched. Then, almost inaudibly, the man spoke. "My name isn't Terry Szymanski." Mary blinked. "What are you talking about?" He turned toward her, eyes hollow, voice low. "My name is Richard Hoagland." In that instant, the two worlds that had coexisted separately for decades collided. The man declared dead in Indiana in 2003 now sat alive in front of a Florida detective, under the name of another man who had died in 1991. Mary stared at him, disbelief spreading across her face. "Richard? Who is Richard?" He didn't answer. Cardo took careful notes, keeping his voice steady. "You're admitting that you assumed the identity of a deceased person?" Richard nodded slowly. "I found the death certificate, years ago. I used it to start over." "Why?" He looked down. "I didn't want to be Richard Hoagland anymore." Mary pushed back from the table, tears welling. "Our whole life, is it even real?" He didn't look at her. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Detective Cardo ended the conversation quietly, informing him that he was under investigation for identity theft and fraud. Richard did not resist. As officers arrived to process the arrest, he stood motionless, hands loosely clasped in front of him. Neighbors peeked through curtains as patrol cars lined the street. One of them, an older man who'd known Terry for years, whispered, "That can't be right. He's the nicest guy I know." Inside the house, Mary sat at the kitchen table. the life she knew unraveling word by word. At the station, Richard gave a full statement. He confessed to everything, finding the death certificate, assuming the identity, building a new life. There were no accomplices, no stolen money, no violence. Only a man who had once walked away and never looked back. When asked if he'd ever thought of returning to his family in Indiana, he shook his head. "They're better off thinking I'm gone." News broke quickly. Headlines read, "Missing Indiana man found alive after 23 years, living under identity of dead fisherman." To the public, it was a story out of fiction. To those who knew him, it was something colder. Proof that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary deceit. In Indiana, Linda received a call from authorities. She was driving when the detective said, "We've found Richard Hoagland." She had to pull over to the side of the road. "Alive?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Alive." She was silent for a long time. Later, she said she couldn't recall feeling joy or anger. "Just emptiness," she told a reporter. "You think you've buried someone twice, first in your heart, then in the law, and still, they find a way to come back." When the story of Richard Hoagland broke, the news spread like wildfire through Florida and Indiana. Missing father found alive after 23 years, living under a dead man's name. The headline read like fiction, but the handcuffs were real. Police escorted him quietly out of the Zephyr Hills home as neighbors watched in disbelief. His wife, Mary, stood frozen on the porch, their teenage son beside her, eyes wide and uncomprehending. The man they knew as husband and father, the man who had tucked their child into bed, fixed the porch light, laughed over Sunday breakfast, was being placed into the back of a patrol car. At the station, officers read the formal charges: identity theft, falsification of government documents, and fraud. His possessions were seized: his passport, pilot's license, real estate records, all bearing the name Terry P. Szymanski. The truth, carefully constructed over 2 decades, collapsed in a matter of hours. Detective Tony Cardo led the follow-up investigation with methodical precision. His team traced the paper trail backward through time: mortgage deeds, tax filings, bank accounts, marriage certificates, every document linked to the false identity. What they found was extraordinary, not for its deceit, but for its simplicity. There were no shell companies, no offshore accounts, no hidden assets. Richard had lived as Terry not to profit, but to erase. He wasn't running a scam, Cardo later said. He was running from himself. The discovery unsettled even the investigators. In a world accustomed to criminal motives, money, violence, power, Richard's reasons seemed almost primitive. The desire to disappear completely, to start over with clean hands and a borrowed name. When detectives questioned his Florida wife, Mary, she was still in shock. "He told me his parents were gone, that he didn't have anyone left," she said, tears streaking her face. "Now I don't even know who I married." She learned that the man she'd shared her life with wasn't just living under an alias. He'd already been declared dead in another state. Their marriage, in the eyes of the law, had never existed. The irony was unbearable. At the courthouse in Pasco County, reporters crowded the steps as Hoagland, or what remained of him, was led inside in an orange jumpsuit. Cameras flashed, recording the image of a man who had once vanished cleanly, now found in the most ordinary way possible. Paperwork. The proceedings were swift. The evidence was indisputable. The prosecutor described how Richard Hoagland had discovered the death certificate of the real Terry Szymanski, used it to obtain a birth certificate, and built a false life. There was no defense to contradict the facts, only context. His public defender argued that Hoagland had committed no financial crimes, no violence, no theft beyond the identity itself. "He simply wanted to live," the lawyer said. He didn't hurt anyone except by leaving. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty of identity theft and falsification of official records. The sentence was modest: time in custody, probation, restitution for the Szymanski family, and the permanent revocation of all documents tied to the stolen name. Florida law required that every record under Terry P. Szymanski be voided. In a single legal act, the man who had lived 2 lives was stripped of both. The name Terry Szymanski was returned to the dead. The name Richard Hoagland was restored to the living, but it carried no home, no family, no history left to return to. When the news reached Indiana, Linda received the call quietly. She was at work, balancing numbers in a ledger, when the detective said, "Ma'am, Richard Hoagland has been sentenced in Florida." She didn't ask for details. She only listened, then thanked him, her tone as measured as her breathing. Later, when a local reporter asked for comment, she said, "I'm not happy, and I'm not angry. I'm empty. He left us with nothing, not even the truth." She still kept his old wedding ring, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. "I wear it sometimes," she said softly. "Not because I miss him, because it reminds me not to disappear from the people who need me." In Florida, his second family retreated from the public eye. Mary changed her last name back to Hickman. Their son, old enough now to understand, refused to speak of his father. "The man I knew," he told a friend, "never existed." Richard Hoagland remained a ghost in legal form, alive, but without an identity the world would accept. His story had begun with an escape, but it ended in confinement. In one state, he had been declared dead. In another, he had been reborn under a stolen name. Now, for the first time in 23 years, he was simply what he had tried so hard not to be, himself. And that, perhaps, was the hardest sentence of all. Years passed after the headlines faded, after the trial concluded, after the world had turned its attention to newer stories. What remained were the quiet lives of those who had once been defined by his disappearance, the people who had lived in the shadow of Richard Hoagland's vanishing, and who now had to live with his return. Matthew and Doug were men by then, far removed from the children who had once waited by the window for their father's car to appear. They had built steady lives. Matthew worked as an engineer in Indianapolis, methodical and reserved. Doug managed a small construction firm, practical and distant. Both declined offers to meet their father. They had spent half their lives burying him, once in grief and again in shame. When reporters reached out, Matthew's only statement was brief. "I wear my father's ring, not out of love, but as a reminder of what not to become." For Doug, the subject was closed entirely. "He walked away," he told a friend. "So we walked on." Their voices held no anger, only exhaustion, the kind that follows years of silence turned solid. Linda lived quietly in Carmel, still married to Tom Eisler, her second husband. Her days were ordinary: morning walks, tending a small garden, volunteering at the local library. In the corner of her living room sat a single photograph, a family of 4, smiling on a summer day in 1992. The image had begun to fade, but she kept it framed. She never replaced it, never removed it. When a journalist once asked her why, she said, "It's not for him, it's for the woman I used to be, the one who still believed that love and truth were the same thing." She had never sought vengeance or spectacle. "I didn't want him punished," she told investigators. "I just wanted to know if he was still alive. That was all." The answer had come, but the relief she imagined never did. If stories of disappearances, double lives, and the fragile line between guilt and survival fascinate you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next real case we uncover.